Hey everybody, in this video we're going to be showing you a great method of painting a Skaven Clanrat for Warhammer Age of Sigmar and, let's face it, Warhammer the Old World, both by Games Workshop. Now when you're painting Skaven you're probably going to want to paint quite a lot of these, so in this video what we're going to do is show you the method that we actually used to use in the old Games Workshop design studio back in the day of the Army Painters team to paint large units really quickly for the books and different publications. Now the method can be easily adapted to any clan that you might want to paint, so no matter what scheme you're going for, this video is going to be useful to you, so we hope you enjoy it. Now if you're new to the channel, be sure to like this video and also subscribe to the channel too, and hit that notification bell to make sure you're kept up to date on all the latest videos that we post here. And also be sure to leave a comment down below telling us whether you're going to paint your Skaven for the Old World or for Age of Sigmar. And without further ado, let's get started. Quick! Before we start painting our Clanrat, the first thing that we need to address is the fact that Skaven really are the quintessential horde army. So if you're painting these miniatures, you're probably going to want to paint quite a lot of them. So with that in mind, I really encourage you to paint them in batches. Try and go for at least groups of 5, but preferably 10 or 20, and basically do one colour on all of them before you move on to the next colour. And if you do this, you'll find it's great encouragement to finish the unit, and also you'll paint them faster than you would if you're doing them one at a time. Now, as I mentioned in the intro, what we're going to be doing in this video is painting it in sort of a classic colour scheme, but really we're going to be approaching it in a way that you can apply to any clan that you might want to paint. But we are going to start out with universal colours that will appear on any of them, which means we're going to start out with things like the fur, the armour, that sort of thing. And the fur is definitely where you should begin, because this way you can dry brush it before you do any neat base coating. So with that in mind, the best thing to do is to undercoat your miniatures with a dark brown. So I've used some Hyrax brown from the Colour Forge here. Now, if you don't have access to a dark brown spray, you could spray them black and then paint them with a dark brown of your choice. The exact colour doesn't specifically matter, just as long as it's a dark brown, you're absolutely fine. And then what we're going to do is start dry brushing over the top of that with some lighter browns to start to pick out the texture of the fur. So the first colour I'm going to be using is Noble Steed Brown, so a nice sort of medium brown, and to apply it you want a small dry brush. So that's what I've got here, small dry brush from Citadel, which we're just going to use just to load up a small amount there on the tip of the bristles, then get some tissue and use it to work the paint into the bristles whilst also removing the excess, and go along until you get to about this sort of strength here. Then all you need to do is start brushing this across the entire miniature with a fairly light flicking motion like this. And the main goal is to pick out the fur, so we're looking at all the limbs and things like that. But at the same time, keep an eye out for any leather, such as the belt we got just here, any pouches, anything like that, and also any wood. Just brush across that as well to give that a nice highlight and start to bring out some of that texture. Once you've finished applying that dry brush of brown to your batch of Skaven, the next thing to do is to move on to a lighter brown. So here I'm going to go for some Wasteland Brown, and again we're going to dry brush it on, just like before. Just make sure that your brush is clean and completely dry though before you start doing this, otherwise you get quite a streaky finish to things. So definitely make sure it's dry, and then get this ready in the same sort of way, getting some of that paint onto the brush, getting some tissue and working it into the bristles until this point. I'm going to be down to about this kind of strength here, so it's going to be a little bit weaker than the previous brown that we put on. The application though is very similar, just a slightly lighter flicking motion now, just very gently like this, so the brown starts to catch more of the extreme texture that's standing out. But otherwise it's a matter of looking for the same sort of areas, so again the fur and any wood and any leather as well. With that dry brushing done, the next thing to do is begin the process of applying base coats in a neat fashion to start to block out all the various details before we wash the miniature. And we should start out with a really important one, which is going to be for the metallics. Now with unit painting in mind, what I try and do here is keep it as minimal as possible, so just go for a silver, but if you want to add in a brass or a copper or anything like that, now's the time to do it. In this case though, I'm just going to use some Cerakote silver, and to apply it, I recommend you go for the biggest brush you can here for this sort of detail work. You want one with a good point on it, but fairly large too, because this really encourages painting quickly. So I have a size 2 here from Artis Opus, but anything like this will be absolutely fine. And as usual, make sure you get that paint thin down on your palette before you apply it, just adding that touch of water so it's nice and smooth. Being careful not to overload the brush so the paint doesn't go out of control, and then it's time to start looking for anything that you want to be metallic. Now the obvious thing to go for is of course the armour, and I do enjoy in Skaven miniatures how they have so much armour on their backs, which really adds to their character. But as well as the plate armour, look out for any chainmail, such as the chain that we've got down here, and also keep an eye out for any weapons, any banding or anything like that, and just block it in as neatly as possible. I've finished base coating the metallics now, and you can see there is quite a bit scattered all across the miniature, and just bear in mind there's quite a bit of variation from Clanrat to Clanrat, so just give them a quick once over once you think you've got all of it to make sure you have got all of it. And once you've done so, it's then time to paint in the flesh of your Skaven. And when it comes to painting their skin, it's a good idea to go for a sort of lighter skin tone to give quite a nice focal point to the miniature, because everything else on the model tends to be quite drab and dark, so a lighter tone works very well here. So with that in mind, I picked out some Dwarven Skin. Then what you'll need is a darker tone to base coat the tail, and here I'm going to use some Barbarian Brawn. But we'll start out with Dwarven Skin, and to apply this one I've gone for a much smaller brush now. I've gone down to a size 0 here, so sort of medium to small one, because we need a little bit of control in applying this. As usual, make sure the paint's thinned and ready and not overloaded on your brush, and then we can start picking out the skin, and we're looking for the hands, the feet and the head. So for the head, it's quite straightforward. You're looking for the smoother parts towards the front just here, just keeping an eye out for any fur as you go along. So on the top of the head there, for example, we just want to go up to the fur but not onto it, following around onto the ears just there. When it comes to the limbs, there's a little thing to do here, which is a case of just blocking them in for the most part, such as the hand just here, the main body of it, just base coat it entirely. But when you get to the part where it meets the fur, so we're looking at the back of the arm here, just around the wrist, just paint the colour up to just a few lines like that, because what that does is give the impression of the flesh going underneath some fur. Once you've got all that flesh, it's then time to move on to base coating the tail with a slightly darker tone. So here I'm using some Barbarian Brawn, and it's back to the large brush here because it's nice and easy to access. All you need to do is block it in. And with that, we're now ready to move on to applying the clan colours onto the miniature. And so the colours you go for here are largely going to be entirely up to you based on what clan you want to do. Now in our case, we're going to do them like on the box, which looks like Clan's Verminous. So in this case, we're going to be looking at sort of different shades of red and some cream on there. But if you're doing something like Clan's Pestilent, in that case, you might want to go for more sort of olivey green tones. Or if you're doing something more old school like Clan Rictus, you might want to go black and white. The choice really is yours. But in our case, we're going to start out with a strong red. So here I've got some Sanguine Scarlet. Then we're going to move on to a darker red. And here I'm going to use some Asmodeus Red. And then finally want a sort of dark bone cream kind of colour. So in this case, I'm going to be using some Dragon Fang. I'm going to start out with the bright red though, which is going to be Sanguine Scarlet. And for this one, I'm going to apply it onto the shield. But when it comes to painting your unit, what I recommend you do is just vary which parts you pick out with these colours, so you get a nice sort of rabble appearance, whilst also unifying the colour scheme overall of the unit. But as I mentioned, I'm going to paint the shield here, and so I'm using a medium-sized brush. This is a size 1, and in this case, what I'm going to do is make sure the paint's thinned down and then start blocking in the face of it. So you can see it's already painted brown, so you could just leave that like wood if you want to, but I want to flash a colour on here. So I'm just going to neatly block this in with this colour. Once you're happy with that first colour, it's time to move on to your second colour. In this case, I've got a darker red. So this is Asmodeus Red, and now I'm looking at the fabrics on the model. In the case of Clanrats, you'll generally have 2 layers, and in this case I'm looking for the lower layer, which is the larger of the 2. I'm just going to neatly block it in, being careful of all surrounding details at this stage. So that chainmail just there, and the leather belt around here. And then finally we can move on to the other layer of clothing, and in this case I want more of a cream colour, so I'm going to be using some Dragon Fang, so a darker bone colour here, and I've switched to a slightly smaller brush now. This is a size 0 just for a bit more control because this layer is a bit smaller. Now, in addition, this is a very convenient colour because we can also use it to base coat the teeth and the claws. So if you're not using this part of the clothing, just be sure to drop in with a colour like this just to pick out these details at this stage as well. And with that, all the base coats are now applied. So once you've got all your Clanrats up to this point, the next thing to do is to put a wash over them. And here you definitely want to go for a dark brown wash for that nice sort of grimy, murky kind of appearance. And so I'm going to use Battlewood Wash here, and to apply it, get yourself a really large brush. I'm using a medium shade brush from Citadel, and all you need to do with this is load up a generous amount, then paint it all over the miniature. And what we need to do is really make sure to work it into all the nooks and crannies as we go along to get that shading in there and also tie all the colours together. Now just bear in mind, it's a good idea to keep an eye on exactly how much is going on here, because it's easy to get carried away and put on too much. And if that happens, it can start pooling and start clogging in detail, and if it dries that way, it looks a bit unpleasant. So just keep an eye on how it settles, and if you start spotting things such as a large amount like this really pooling like that, just use your brush like a sponge just to soak away the excess and redistribute it elsewhere around the miniature. And once you have got it all over, give it plenty of time to dry. I'd recommend about 45 minutes before you move on to the next stage. Once that wash is dry, you'll be left with a miniature that's got that shading on there, but some details have gone a bit murky, so now what we're going to do is clean them up by doing some layering. Now, if you're looking at painting loads of these models really quickly and you don't want to worry about getting into the reeds of too much detail, then just make sure that you prioritise doing the layering on the face and on the teeth. But in case you want to do everything, we're going to go through everything here. So we'll do that by starting out with that skin, including the face. In this case, we're going to return to the original colour that we used, which in our case was Dwarven Skin. And to apply it, I'm going to be using my size 0 brush here, and the application is going to be quite similar to the original base coat, just a bit more selective now. As before, make sure the paint's thinned down and under control on your brush, and then the idea is to reapply this colour onto flatter areas whilst avoiding recesses. So if we look at the face, for example, that means following areas such as the top of the head, where we want to go over the eyes just there, down the nose towards the end of it right there. You can see all the while I'm just looking for it's darker and skipping past those bits. Same there, just around the muzzle, around the mouth, and on the cheek just there. So just little bits like that, just to help clean those parts up and help them stand out a bit more. Same's going to be true on the hands and feet, where just don't worry too much about very shallow recesses like the back of the hand, but when you get to the fur, just carry on that lining technique we did earlier to continue that gradient between the flesh and the fur, and the fingers just follow along the raised areas such as just under there. With that done, you can see now the face especially really stands out as a nice focal point. And as I mentioned, if you're just trying to limit the amount of things that you're doing here, just move on to doing the teeth next. But what we're going to do is layer everything else. And one of those you might want to do is the fur. This is something you also might just want to leave for a unit champion or something like that. But if you decide you want to do this, go back to the lighter brown that you dry brushed on. So in this case, it's Wasteland Brown. And to apply it, go for that same smaller brush. So I'm using the size 0 again. And with this, all we're going to do is just emphasize a bit of the furry texture on parts that stand out. So you don't need very much, and this should be quite a quick stage to do, really. We're looking at things like on the arm here, where you can see you've got a bit of the musculature showing through underneath the fur. What you do is just line on a few little bits of this colour in that area, just to make it a little bit lighter. So only small amounts there like that, just to build up that texture of fur. Now that's done, we're going to move on to layering 3 more colours on the miniature, and we'll start out with the one that's going to be the bone, but also in this case it's that cream fabric too. And here I'm going a little bit lighter than what I used on the base coat here, especially because that bone, just want to emphasise it a bit more. So here I'm going to use some Skeleton Legion. Then it's back to those 2 reds. So here we'll start out with Sanguine Scarlet, then after that it's a case of moving on to Asmodeus Red. But first of all, what we need is that bone colour, so I'm going to be using Skeleton Legion, and I'm applying it again with my size 0 brush here, and this is going to be for, as I mentioned, all the bones, so we're looking at teeth and claws, but also we can use it for that fabric at the same time. So once the paint's thinned and ready, we can start out with those teeth and claws, and here, all you need to do is just put a little bit of this colour on those areas just down the centre, just to emphasise them a little bit more. Now you can see in this one, this case of this Skaven here, we've got a few tiny little teeth to pick out, it's just little ones there like that, but the main prominent ones are these ones right at the front. Now, when it comes to the fabric, in this case, we're aiming for the flatter areas. I want to carefully avoid recesses. So always make sure you angle the model so that you're nice and comfortable, and just apply it onto those flat regions, looking for any recesses in the fabric, any little creases, and basically just skipping past those parts. With that colour done, it's then time to move on to the reds, and I'm going to start out with some Sanguine Scarlet. So in this case, it's back to that shield. I'm still using the size 0 brush because here you can see we've got that wooden texture. What we need to do is just make sure we pick that out. So I'm going to paint this as lines, just looking for the raised up parts and just really emphasising those as I go along this feature here. And then finally, it's back to Asmodeus Red for these darker red parts. Still with a size 0 brush, and here it's fabric that we're layering, so it's a matter of looking for flat areas again and avoiding the recessed parts of creases. So you can see these flat areas just here, just thinly apply the colour over them, but be careful when you get to areas such as this right here. And with that, the layering stage is now complete, and so we can move on to the next phase, which is going to be to highlight the miniature. Now, as ever, doing the highlighting is entirely optional. You certainly don't need to. I do recommend that you paint in the eyes, however, and then move on to basing your miniature if you're going to skip past this. But if you do want to highlight the model, we are going to go through all the colours to show you how to do it. The most important of those is to start out with that flesh. So you might just want to only highlight the flesh, which will be perfectly fine. In this case, what you'll need, though, is a paler flesh tone than you used for that original mid-tone. So in this case, I'm going to use some Elven Skin. And to apply it, I've gone for a really small brush now and right down to a size 00. And with this, we just want to emphasize parts of the skin that really stand out. So don't worry about the tail for the time being. This is purely the lighter parts. We've got the hands, feet, and the head. And once you've got the paint thinned and ready, we can start looking for such features, and it's going to be things like around the brows. So you can see we've got these edges that stand out quite pronounced just around here. What we want to do is just pick them out with just a little bit of this colour. So just there, same is going to be true on the ears, where we just go around that ridge right there. We've got the cheek just down here, then going around the side of the muzzle. There's a few ridges on top there, so just a few lines there like that. And you can see doing this then just really emphasises the character of this Skaven. When it comes to the hands and the feet, on the back of them, just look for those tendons on the back of the hands here. We just want a few quick lines just going along there like that, and a little bit on the thumb just there. And when it comes down to the feet, we're just going to go along these ridges that stand out. So just along areas such as along here like that, and on the heel back here. And there we are, the skin's highlighted. So now what we're going to do is start moving through the other colours we've got on the model, showing you how to highlight those. And the first of these is going to be the fur, which again is entirely optional, but if you want to do this, what you'll want now is a pale khaki colour. So I'm going to use some temple stone for this, and with it we're just going to exaggerate that fur texture just slightly. So it's going to be a lot like when we were layering it, in fact, just slightly more delicate now. I'm still using my small brush for this, so it's the size 00, and all you need is a small amount of that colour, just a small thin amount there like that. And then on the fur, wherever it stands out, like these little parts we've got here on the back of the arm, just to flicker a little bit of this colour towards the end of these strands, just little bits here like this. And with that, we can now move on to highlighting the clothing and the shield. Now the colours used here will vary depending on exactly what sort of colour scheme you've gone for, but the first of them is going to be a colour that you'll need to pick out all the teeth and claws as well, which will be a light bone colour. So no matter what scheme you're going for, definitely start out with this one. In this case, I'm going to be using some vampire fang, and as I mentioned, we can use it on the cream coloured fabrics too. Then we've got to move on to the reds. So for the shield, I'm going for a very bright red here. I'm going to use some demon red in this case. Then for the clothing, I'm going to go for a sort of salmony orange colour. So I'm going to use evil eye red here. But first of all, what we need is that light bone colour. So I'm using Vampire Fang, and to apply it, I'm sticking to my small brush, so the size 00 again. And with this, we can first of all highlight the teeth and claws. And so all you'll need is a small amount of this. And really, it's just a case of emphasising these slightly and making them appear sharp at the end. So it's just a little bit of this colour on the ends of these details, such as that tooth right there. On the claws, it's just a small amount on the end of each one of these as well. Just a fine line, really, at the very end. Now, when it comes to the clothing, we need to emphasise the creases in the fabric. So just angle the model to make sure you're comfy and look for the peak of that crease. So on this one, for example, and then with a downward motion like this, just follow that line all the way along. And also be sure to go around the outline of it as well. So following the hem, and in this case, you can actually use the side of your brush close to the tip and just skim along that edge there like that to get a nice highlight on the edge of this detail. Once that's done, it's time to move on to the brighter of the two reds, and in this case I'm using some demon red, and we're looking at the shield here, which does have this wooden texture to it. So first of all, using the side of the brush, just going to skim around the outside of it to get an edge highlight going along there, and then it's time to highlight these individual planks. So I'm just going to angle the model, so I'm painting downwards with this kind of motion here. It's a matter of following each plank with a highlight along each edge, and also we've got this little notch in the shield just here, so I'm going to go around that as well. And then finally, we can highlight the darker red fabric using Evil Eye Red. And this is going to be applied just like we did on that cream coloured fabric earlier on, where we're looking for the peaks of any creases and following those, and also the outer edge of the fabric. And with that, the clothing's now fully highlighted, so we just need to highlight two more colours before we move on to a little finishing touch. And that is going to be, first of all, to highlight the tail, and here we can use some Dwarven Skin again, but then what we should do is highlight all of that metal, and here I'm going to use some Mithril Blades, a nice shiny silver for that one. But we'll start out by highlighting the tail, so here I'm going to use Dwarven Skin, and to apply it I'm going to be keeping with my small brush, so I'm using the size 00 once again. And with this, we just need to emphasise a bit of the texture on the tail. So those sort of rings that are going around it, basically just need to paint along those. So you just need a small amount of this thinned and ready. And then just angle the tail so you're looking at it in this kind of direction. Then do a downward flicking motion on each of these rings. So you only need one just next to that little recess there, and just basically work your way along doing this. And this way, the texture of that tail stands out really nicely. And then finally, we can move on to a bright silver to highlight the armour. So here I'm using some Mithril Blade, and first of all we need to go around all sharp edges and angles, so where possible use the side of the brush and just skim along areas like this to get a nice highlight on those parts. But in addition, if you want to, you can add a few scratches onto the flat of these metal plates, and if you want to do that, just do a few little quick flicks just along the areas like that, just to give the impression of some scratches. And And with that, all those details on the Clanrat are now fully highlighted, so we can move on to a finishing touch, which is going to be to paint the eyes. Now, I know what you're thinking, painting eyes in a Skaven seems like quite an extravagance, but it's worth doing because actually the eyes are surprisingly large and quite easy to pick out, and doing them adds an enormous amount of character to the miniatures, so it's worth just taking a few minutes to do it. Now, the first thing to do is to make sure the eyes are quite dark, which they should be at this stage from the brown wash we used earlier on, but if they're not, just run a dark brown into there just to really shade things down. Then what you'll need is a bright red, so here I'm going to use some Demon Red. Now, if you want to take it a little bit further, you certainly can do, and here you'll need a bright orange. So in this case, I'm going to use some orange flare, but you certainly need to start out with that red. This is really the minimum for it, really just to help them pop out. And so I'm using Demon Red, as I mentioned. To apply it, go for your fine brush again. So I'm back to my size 00 here. And with this, all you need is a small amount, thin down and ready, and just make sure the bristles come to a fine point on your brush. And then what you need to do is just brace your hands to be as steady as possible, gently move in with the tip of the brush and just pick out the ball of the eye. So just in there, just dot into this region right here. We've now got that red applied, so you can leave the eyes here if you want to, but if you want them to pop just a little bit more, it's time to add a bright orange. So here I've got some orange flare, and with this, all you need to do is just to put a little dot in the middle of each eye. Now with this done, it's then time to base the miniature, and as ever, it's entirely your choice what basing scheme you go for, but in this case, I'm going to go for a grasslands base. And with the base now fully painted, this Skaven Clanrat is complete and ready to go to war in the name of his clan and probably stab his friends in the back. Yes, yes! So in this video, as you've seen, we've painted this Clanrat all the way through to completion by highlighting all the details on there. But bear in mind, if you're going to be painting a lot of these, you might not want to do that many highlights in the miniature. So remember to focus on the parts that are important. In the case of Skaven, really, it's around the face. So be sure to highlight all the skin there and paint the teeth if you're keeping things to a minimum. You might want to highlight the armor on the back as well, but really just focus on those important things and take the highlights as far as you might want to go. So have fun painting your Clanrats, and we'll see you again very soon.